Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. As Serbia's anti-corruption protests continue, thousands gathered in Belgrade this weekend despite heavy rain to oppose government measures perceived as undermining university autonomy. Now, the demonstrations, sparked by a deadly infrastructure collapse in Novi Sad last November, have evolved into a broader movement demanding political accountability and democratic reforms. Joining us today on TVP World to provide insight is Professor Ivanka Popović of the University of Belgrade. A distinguished academic and former rector, Professor Popović has been a prominent voice advocating for academic freedom and institutional integrity amid the ongoing unrest. Hello, ma'am, and welcome to TVP World.
Good afternoon.
So how did we even get here in the first place? We have the collapse of the Novi Sad train station, which turned into escalated protests with crackdowns, and now we've seen complaints about the educational autonomy. Is this another part of the crackdown by the Vučić government?
Well, you know, what started as an absolutely normal response to a tragedy that could have been avoided, because obviously there is very serious allegations of corruptions in many large infrastructural projects going on in Serbia. And the students and professors started this protest as a means of trying to pressure the government into doing something about it, to have the accountability that you mentioned, that those who were responsible were prosecuted. This unfortunately didn't materialize, and after 5 months of protest, the students realized that the government was now the problem, because they were not willing to actually allow for institutions to be independent and to carry out their duties. And absolutely, that rule of law was absolutely brought into question. So the students have now asked for parliamentary elections. The president, who is responsible for calling elections, is not responding. We have had also, as you can see in the picture, some political prisoners, that students and young activists that were actually illegally tapped and listened to, were arrested and have not been released from prison. So it's a rather unpleasant situation that we are faced with, because you have the feeling that no one is hearing the voice of the citizens, and the government is just moving on with their normal agenda. And the students have actually given the government a deadline till June 7th to call for parliamentary elections. If this doesn't happen, they will initiate further forms of protest. They say they will radicalize, but that does not mean it will become violent. It just means it will become more intense. We are also facing elections in two local elections in two municipalities in Serbia, where, of course, the accountability of the government in terms of fair elections, which is very highly debated because of previous experience with the elections in June and last December. So these will be trial and test cases to see whether the democratic process is possible. And therefore, I just see that we are looking toward days that will be very dynamic, and that simply the people will not rest and will not stop protesting until some change is made in Serbia, and the government will need to concede at one point.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm very curious because, like you mentioned, a lot of these requests were not really being heard by the government. Despite large-scale protests, it seems like the demands were falling on deaf ears. And like you also mentioned, the students are giving a deadline until June 7th until things might escalate even further. Do you think at this point we have crossed a critical juncture in which, if it's not for any more escalation, perhaps nothing will ever be done?
Well, this is actually the key point, because instead of responding to the situation in the country, what we see the government doing is actually cracking down on the university. And, professors or employees' salaries at universities have been cut down to 12.5%, where there has been a decision made that the teachers will not be paid for teaching, and also let's say the proportion of teaching and research has been brought to a ridiculous level, that only teachers or professors are working in research 5 hours a week, and 35 hours a week there is teaching. And of course there are blockades, so there is no teaching, and they're actually trying to literally starve the academic population into submission. And the education minister is proclaiming that classes will start next week, and this is not happening. The students are not happy with this. Now, no one wants to compromise the school year, but we are faced with also the government's decision to very quickly implement and pass a new law on higher education that would probably be much more controlling, in terms that the government would be actually choosing rectors and deans, and that the financial flow would be highly controlled by the government. So we are seeing a very oppressive situation where somehow the university seems to be responsible for the government's problems, or problems of actually dealing with this situation. And of course, this is not something that will lead to a pacification. Actually, everyone is even more now disturbed by what's going on. So I think the protests will continue. And then we had some protests over the weekend, and these protests will continue. I think in the very near future, there will be another large protest in Belgrade. So things are not stopping at all. And I think people are very determined, because they don't see any other alternative. If things stay as they are, the corruptive, captured state will actually be only serving itself and not the citizens. And people are feeling really threatened by this.
All right, like you say, the status quo is not going to be the way to go. So in this sense, what step, in your opinion, should be taken to address the protesters' demand and, more importantly, restore trust in public institutions?
Well, of course, dialogue must be maintained. There must be communication, and there has to be goodwill. And at the moment, we are not seeing the goodwill on the side of the government. And that means we have to force the government to hear what the citizens are saying. So I think the only way to do this is by, public disagreement, by public display of dissatisfaction with how the government is functioning. So that means we need to put more and more pressure onto the government, because we have seen in the past, when this pressure was significant enough, there were some concessions made by the government. But of course, the worry is, because this alleged corruption could lead to the very top of government, it's not in the government's interest to actually allow for prosecutors to do their job. So, as I said, it's a very, very sensitive situation, how to move forward. And of course, I think the European Union is slowly realizing that the situation in Serbia is quite serious, and is monitoring closely what is happening.
Right, definitely a very difficult dialogue to have there. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.